really want to talk about the experience in Victoria, some of the pluses and some of the challenges, and hopefully this will be helpful as Queensland moves forward further into kinship care. And the next thing I have to do is to work out how to move from one slide to another. Okay, right, all right, I think we're there. So I just want to go back and share a story about something I did way back. You can see how elderly I am. I was running a large residential service for MacKillop Family Services back at the end of the last century. And this was at a time when MacKillop had just formed, and it was going through a huge amount of change and getting used to integration of services. That a number of different services have worked very differently from each other. So the first year was pretty hectic. It was, as I said, a large service that I was in charge of. And after the first year, when we'd sorted a lot of things out, got to know each other, stabilised the staffing, found the vehicles, I was advised that the department was going to outsource almost all of its residential care. This was Jeff Kennett government, if any of you remember that name. And suddenly all residential care had to leave the department, had to leave it now. With difficulty, I said to my boss, we're not ready for this. And the response was, we have to do it. If we don't, we'll be sidelined. So I was being asked to set up 6 residential units in 8 months. That's why all the little houses there. Well, you can imagine what that was like. And of course, in that climate, relations weren't as good as they might have been, and thinking wasn't as good as it might have been. I got comments like 4 walls and a roof, that's all they need. And I just completed a master's around residential care recruitment and selection. I knew the importance of doing it well, but I was told, oh, isn't it all just a matter of a gut feeling? So it was a difficult time. We got there, but there were certain compromises made and we paid the price for those. So I just wanted to bring that experience to bear on where you are now in terms of just highlighting the risks of moving fast and looking at quantity over quality. The comments that I've heard from Deirdre and from the other speakers on the panel, unfortunately I lost the end of them because of the streaming, indicate that there is a lot of awareness of the importance of doing this right, which is heartening. But of course, one of the issues is poverty and deprivation in kinship care. And is it going to be a picture of the happy families kicking the ball around, or is it going to be an overcrowded house and insufficient resources of all kinds? So how can you ensure that this is going to be done well? Looking now at your figures, my trusty IT help desk in the background also helps me to plot the figures every year that come out from the Institute of Health and Welfare, looking at out-of-home care across the country. And this graph shows pretty much what Deirdre was talking about, the increase in residential care in Queensland. That anomaly there on the red line, which is kinship care, which looks like suddenly you've got a dramatic fall in the numbers in kinship care. This is an anomaly. It's about the counting systems where the way numbers have been counted has been varied in the different states. And now one by one, the states are pulling any permanent care, children in permanent care, whatever it's called in the different states, they're pulling them out of the out-of-home care statistics. Queensland did that about a year or 2 ago. So that's what that's about. Presumably there were a lot more in kinship care on permanent orders than in foster care. And that's why you've got that dip. But you can see that the trajectory is still the same. In fact, it may be a little steeper. So the numbers are going up in kinship care, but not fast enough to pick up the increase that's going into residential care. Now, this graph, of course, is a little complicated. We didn't put all the states on it because it would have been such a mess. You wouldn't be able to read anything. But if you just know that importantly, yours is the maroon lines that show down the bottom here, what you saw on the other slide more easily. Looking at the top lines, the blue aqua lines, that's New South Wales. And you can see they've been ahead of the game in terms of kinship care for a very long time. You can see that anomalies come in New South Wales a bit earlier. And it's also evident that they're, can you see my pointer? I don't think you can. That their foster care numbers are reducing. Kinship care numbers appear to be reducing a little, but they're way higher. In Victoria, what you've got here is a huge rise in kinship care and really a big drop in foster care. So this is a picture where people might say, well, isn't this fantastic? Victoria's leading the way. And in some ways that might be true, but I also want to alert you to the challenges that can be involved in that. Deirdre and other speakers after her have identified some of the well-established benefits of kinship care. Paul Nixon, back in 2008, did a comprehensive review of the research, and these findings very much echo what Kate was talking about and what Deirdre talked about. And so there are some very good reasons to start thinking more about kinship care and how we can increase the number of placements in kinship care. Basically moving a child to a more stable part of their own family. UK conducted an inquiry into care some years ago, and they picked up really comments again that I think Kate made about love and commitment, and people who are ambitious for them, help them succeed, will go the extra mile, will stick with them and treat them as part of their family beyond childhood and into adulthood, which I think is a really important point that's already been made this morning. And the point about contact has also been made. I did a large survey of family contact in kinship care some years ago, and these comments come from that. You can see from the graph that children were in touch with not just mums and dads, but uncles, aunts, grandparents, and other relatives. And so that really sets a child up potentially for a network of people who care about them for life. This is, I hope you can read this. I know you're looking at a big screen. I got the figures as big as I could, but then really nowhere near big enough for an ideal presentation. This comes again from the Institute of Health and Welfare, which have in the last few years been trying to collect data on the relationship between kinship carers and the children in their care. And so they had, for a few years, they've been reporting that 50% of kinship carers are grandparents. Suddenly the numbers dropped to 20%. Why is that? Well, actually what it is if you look at the other figures highlighted in yellow, they have now brought the unavailable, the not stated, not available figures into the table. I chatted to them about this a year or two ago and argued that hiding that, well, it wasn't so much hiding that material, but it was included elsewhere in their data, was not helpful because it distorted the picture. And I'm thrilled to see that they have brought that data into the table now. So not to say that when we really know the picture, it won't be more like what they reported before, but really what we need to recognise is that we don't know where the children are. We don't know who they're with. In Victoria, when I presented data of this sort some years ago, they did actually start making the carer relationship field mandatory to be completed in the child protection database. And it'll be a while before things catch up so that we get a clearer picture in Victoria. But this is something to alert all states to, is whether you're collecting this data clearly and accurately so that you know who the children are actually with. Okay, we've looked pretty much at the rosy side of kinship care, but I want to alert you to the hazards, and the first one has been reported, has been spoken about this morning already, that carers often are older, poorer, in poorer health, often single, usually women. Many grandparents, many with their own trauma histories, they often care for more children because they have that commitment to keep the siblings together. And they're close to the parents. So there can be difficulties with contact, difficulties in interpersonal relationships, conflict that the children are caught up in, and so on. And particularly if they're older, there's the challenge of adolescence coming. And sorry, if the carers are older, is what I mean there. Aboriginal kinship care, and we're going to hear from Candice shortly, but just to make the point that all the pressures are the same, only more so. Families are bigger, there's greater poverty, there's greater incidence of poor health, and so on. And that Aboriginal family members feel that imperative to care even more strongly than others. So sometimes it's just not possible to say no, even when actually no should be the correct answer for that particular circumstance. So that's just a comment from that older survey about the stress on caregivers, an older couple being tired without respite. Contact with parents has been mentioned before, that generally it's a challenging area for all kids in care, but in kinship care it's complicated by that emotional involvement of the carers with the children's parents. Sometimes if it is an informal setting in which contact takes place, and overwhelmingly that's what children and young people tell us they want, then the constraints are quite limited in terms of how to manage difficult situations. On the other hand, where it's supervised, all the parties hate it, and things become very stilted, and that generates its own tensions. And also the risks to safety can be hidden in the private space of the family, so that research suggests that kinship care is probably at least as safe as foster care, but because it's not supervised as closely as foster care, we don't always know. So some of the pluses in kinship care and the keenness to move to kinship care then does tend to generate myths around kinship care. And the first one was the old one that we all believed back in about the 80s, when you'd never discharge a child from care, as we used to call it, into family, because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Obviously, that family is dysfunctional all the way through. Well, we've changed that one. We changed it pretty suddenly from the apple doesn't fall far from the tree to, well, if they're with family, they're safe, they're loved, cared for. That kinship care is a type of foster care, and I think that's been alluded to, that we're coming to grips with the fact that it's actually a very different type of care. Kinship care families are just like normal families. This sort of speaks to the wish not to need to do too much for them. That it's all grandparent care. We've spoken about that. And if we start to understand that it's not all grandparent care, then we start thinking it's all in the extended family, and we're blind to the numbers that may in fact be in community or friends care, as we call it. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So this is the one where then we tend to assume where they are with family and friends, that their needs are similar to the family. Kinship care is cheaper than foster care. Now, this one's been alluded to, but this, I think, is a huge risk, because although practitioners may be keen to keep their eye on quality, the bean counters are really keen on the fact that it's perceived as cheaper than foster care. There's no doubt it's cheaper than residential care. That's just unarguable. I would argue that if it's done well, it won't be cheaper than general foster care. And that'd be partly because kinship families will need help with issues, not just to be referred to places in the community. Family finding has been alluded to. This is really at the heart of doing it well. Have we explored all the alternatives? Did we have the time? Did we have the resources to do it? And I believe that one of the biggest issues is around assessment. So one of the things that's very different about kinship care in the way we practice it in formal or statutory services is that unlike residential care and foster care, where carers have been pre-assessed and pre-trained before service, in kinship care, this is an entry point, so the child goes straight into the placement. Obviously, people need to do an initial screening to make sure it's safe, and then the full assessment will come a bit later. But I think we tend to be a bit blind to the fairly dramatic consequences of that way of operating. There isn't time to do massive standard assessment for general foster care. And in fact, some of the good placements in kinship care actually wouldn't meet that standard. But what it means is that we then, that we've always had two standards for assessing care, but we've brought one of them into statutory out-of-home care, and that is the one that we use for removal by child protection. So removal is, of course, governed by legislation. We need to provide evidence of abuse, neglect, abandonment, and so on. We don't remove children, obviously, because they have poor parenting or deprivation. And we understand that many children in our community will grow up in poverty. So the old woman that lived in a shoe, well, nobody comes around and takes her kids just because there's a lot of them and because there's not much money to go around. To be a foster care, of course, it's very different. We have this in-depth pre-placement assessment, and we're not looking at that baseline for removal. We're looking at quality of care, safety, emotional resources, financial resources. What's the housing like? Are they aware of the protocols that we operate under? Carers are really in real poverty. They don't tend to put up their hands if they're struggling financially. So the old woman who lived in her shoe, but she won't make that grade because of the poverty, because of the number of kids, because of the very clear housing problems you can see there on the screen. So I would say the biggest problem in terms of quality of care is that the placement prior to assessment prejudices the assessment. We then look at the assessment in terms of, well, can we justify removing a child from an environment where they've already settled in and people want them to stay and perhaps they want to stay. So we're reducing that assessment criterion back to the child protection removal standard rather than the foster care standard. Time pressure being the enemy because there isn't time to do it properly right at the start. Well, not the way we operate typically in Victoria anyway. So these are all the issues that we actually need to be assessing for. That pre-existing relationship that we assumed is part of kinship care, is it a real thing? Do they really know these relatives? Do they really know this community person who's put up their hand to care for them? Have we looked broadly at the issue of safety? Do we know who comes in and out of the house, what their relationships are, what the carer's capacity is to manage those situations? What about the long haul? What about the impacts of trauma? Bearing in mind, many families may be loving and caring, but it's a whole different thing to be caring for your own children and to be caring for children who've gone through trauma and then have had a disrupted family life. What about the material circumstances? Will the child grow up in poverty? Can you do enough to augment that? So I believe in Queensland, you've got a real opportunity with this outsourcing of children's care from residential care. Because the children are already in care, there isn't an urgency about it. There's only an urgency if you declare there's an emergency. Other than that, the kid is in placement. Presumably, the placement is safe enough, and you have the chance to do thorough family finding. You have the chance for pre-placement assessment rather than post-placement assessment. You can do it properly. So these two processes that are at the heart of quality care are possible if you're in a position to take those opportunities. It's also that question of support. So a lot of support is needed to these families. And these are some of the areas that are evident for kinship care practice. Education, mental health, family dynamics. How does contact work, not just with the parents, but with others? And really addressing that issue of poverty so that carers can afford to send their kids on camps, can afford them to get a new school uniform when they need it, can afford those extracurricular activities that other families enjoy. The support is not just needed in that early phase. In Victoria, we focus very much on the early phase. We're still struggling to implement the model the way it was intended, but the early phase is not the whole story. So that circumstances change. The early phase might go quite smoothly. There might be a honeymoon for a while. Things can get bumpy at any stage. And really, I would maintain that for placements to remain stable, and this would apply for any sort of placement, help is needed when it's needed. So when the child or the family put up their hand, that's when they need help. And that could be 2 years down the track, 3 years down the track. Okay. I really just want to talk for a moment about non-familial kinship care and going back to that data and whether Queensland is collecting accurate data now or can do work to ensure that that data will be accurate so that you know how many children are actually in non-familial kinship care. In Victoria, we don't know, but anecdotally through the services, the impression is that it's actually very high. I did a whole research project around this area at one stage, and that was certainly what was conveyed to me. How many of those people that are not family actually have a genuine, strong, pre-existing relationship with the children that they're going to take on? Quite often they can be parents of children who the child goes to school with. They might be next door neighbours. Sometimes even people will go to a church community and ask someone to put up their hands. That person mightn't know the child at all. Maybe they do go to the same church, maybe they don't. But essentially, this is not kinship care. Candice, of course, is about to talk about the Indigenous aspect of all of this. And I think this non-familial kinship care poses a particular threat for Indigenous children, so that if they're in non-Indigenous so-called kinship care, do we know what percentage of those placements are with Indigenous carers? Or are these kinship care relationships very much skewed towards Indigenous kids with non-Indigenous carers, such as teachers, youth workers, church people, community members, next door neighbours? And in Victoria, certainly this has been a huge issue, that many of these placements that used to be called foster care and now called kinship care are not really with kin as culturally defined. What percentage of these non-familial placements were agreed to by the responsible Indigenous organisation? So I guess the point I want to really leave you with is that the risks are about going too hard and too fast, and then you find that you can't do adequate family finding. that the child might get sort of popped into the family somewhere because it's family, but it's not always a suitable placement within the family. But this issue about non-familial kinship care, placements that actually should have been general foster care and properly pre-assessed. So we can close our eyes to the fact that quality of care is lacking because it's family, and we can rationalise. And really, so the tip of the iceberg then becomes placements that are frankly unsafe and placements where abuse emerges later. And bearing in mind that unless you're watching these placements as closely as with general foster care, these things may come out much later or never. So the cost effectiveness one is one that I guess makes me see red a bit. And here's the bean counter, taking away from what we've been saying, their own take on it. And we've certainly got an elephant in the room in Victoria with our massive investment in kinship care, but we really do struggle to give kinship care even the level of service that foster care did. So just to go back to a slide I gave you earlier and reiterating the words of previous speakers, we know that there are significant benefits in kinship care, but there are significant benefits in kinship care if it's good kinship care. Not all kinship care is good kinship care. Great outcomes are certainly possible, and you probably recognise that young man on the right. He's not so young anymore. He got quite a lot of grey hairs in the last decade. Nevertheless, his life started off well with his grandparents, and he went to great heights. Some of the references, and we're there. So I'll stop screen sharing now. How's that, Tom? Yep, I'm back on the screen now. Yep, all right.
Yes, you can. Good.
Yeah,
I should actually say there was a Telstra outage at the beginning of Meredith's presentation.
Oh dear.
So for people at home at the office too, if there was some delay because of that as well, we are recording these things, so the presentation. So we'll be able to send you material if you did miss any of that at the beginning when there was a Telstra outage.
I can't really hear Lindsay now.
It's okay. You don't have to worry about it. You don't wait for Telstra. So it's the good bloke you work with there. Maybe he does. Yeah. Anyway, so we have time for maybe one or two quick questions, and but I imagine that we will come back to some of the things that Meredith talked about in the last session of the day as well. I thought perhaps Megan and Kate, there were a lot of risks that Meredith outlined as well that are worth taking note of, I guess, as we pursue this. So if there's something newsworthy in what she had to say, if you wanted to mention that.
I think that was why I tried to present some of the complicators and said, that we do know about older age, poorer health, less income, less instability, and we do have to pay those variables attention. It would be naive not to, and we are all focused on safe care for children.
Yep, so. And not. I guess the take-home message was also not doing it so quickly that we compromise in how well we are doing it. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Any other questions for Meredith or comments? Yes.
Hi, Lindsay. I'd just like to make a comment on the kinship carer. And I don't know if Queensland are doing it better, but in terms of kinship carers having the same degree of scrutiny, support, relationships with the department, with IFYS, I think it's all very good, but I feel loved to death. Yeah. So to quote the Premier.
Yes.
So I'm absolutely confident with my colleagues here, Kinship, that we have that level of scrutiny But I had not really considered the other safety issues that had been brought up by Meredith that really highlight the need to, for very high level risk management strategy.
Oh,
We had the
that's
children in
excellent.
our care before we went through significant clinical assessment and not knowing one. But I think if we're an example of what Queensland does, I think they do it pretty well, in my opinion.
Yes. Glad to I've wasted, I guess, in that process as well. I'm not sure if you heard that, Meredith, but it was very useful. Oh, we'll tell you about it later, yeah, but it was very... You'll be very interested. Any other comments or questions? Yes, at the back?
Yeah, a bit more of a comment, so to speak, but I've worked with two...
Hang on, we'll just give you the mic so Meredith can hear.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Meredith can hear. Hi Meredith, my name's Kylie. I've worked with two families where the grandparents have become the kinship carer, and I know for them it was very difficult because they just took on the role as a grandparent to look after their grandchild. What they don't understand lack is the legalities around it all. So the orders, the do's and don'ts and cans and can'ts and all this sort of stuff, and it can be very overwhelming. And that alone has been known to impact that placement. So will there be some support or something created or developed for new or upcoming kin carers that can help them understand the whole process a bit better?
Do you want to comment, Meredith, or...?
I wonder if one of you could just rephrase the question aspect of that for me.
I think more just bringing it to attention. I think that, we work in the field and we are familiar with legalities and stuff, but for kin carers, they don't have any idea, and it can become very confusing and overwhelming, like the whole process of taking on a child, whether it's your grandchild or not.
Like the court processes, the legal terminology, names of orders, it's all overwhelming, yeah.
Because, for one particular family, they actually say, we're carers first, then their grandmother or grandfather, and it's quite sad that it has to be like that. So I'd like to see something.
I think all I can say about that is to affirm that issue and to, confirm that really that is an issue for practice in Queensland as to how much you can do, because that will come up over and over again. Perhaps with grandparents, or really with any kinship carer, they're likely to see themselves as part of the family, doing the things that families do, and sometimes find it quite difficult to understand the legislative framework and expectation and protocol.
I expect that
their circumstances.
Yeah, I suspect it's going to be an issue that the panel this afternoon is going to talk about as well, but you wanted to comment as well?
I would say that I do totally agree with that, and having experienced that myself, so it's probably maybe on panel.
Yeah, that'd be good, yes, excellent. I think that'd be very useful.
It's not just for grandparents, I'm a grandparent myself, but I think it's for all I think it's for all kinship carers across the board. It's very difficult to navigate the system, and it does add to a level of stress.
Yep.
We're already dealing with a lot of stress, and in a new situation, you're trying to navigate a whole lot of new things, and there just needs to be, I think, a lot of open communication and transparency of what's going on. Small things, bits of feedback, sorts of things that can make you feel more comfortable and less worried, because you're invested in your children, you love them dearly, and they're your family.
Yes.
You need to be involved.
And I think one of the things everyone in this room experiences, all those acronyms, like all those acronyms are used in any kind of single meeting that you have with people, and you've got no idea what people are talking about. Yep.